You're listening to Kitchen Table Finance. Join Dave Shotwell and Nick Nauta as they cut through the complexity of financial planning and serve bites of investment advice that are both personal and practical.
Hey Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
I am also doing very well, thank you, sir. Is it just me, or does the sun shine every time we do a podcast?
It's like the clouds have broken. I'm seeing the sun for the first time, probably the first time in November right now.
I think our podcast is so moving that it's changing the clouds environment around us.
Skies are blue. Yes.
Time for a podcast.
Drying out. Yep.
So we're going to try something new today, Dave, and I hope this is something that kind of catches on and we can continue to do on a regular basis. But that is just taking a look at, I know you and I both do a fair deal of reading when it comes to retirement planning, personal finance stuff. And it just kind of dawned on me that I am a person who loves to read headlines of things that I'm not super interested in, like college football or, political stuff going on in the Middle East. And I also am very aware that that's a dangerous thing to do because most of these headlines are designed to get you to click through, right?
Right.
So if you just read the headlines as this is an absolute fact, you don't actually click in and figure out what they're talking about or why it may or may not make sense.
Right.
And so I have this assumption that that's what people do with personal finance.
Right. And so, like with a lot of those topics, it'd be good to have a curator, right?
Right. Exactly.
Right. Yep. So here's our curated bespoke list of the stuff we've seen in personal finance blogs, posts, sections of major newspapers over the last couple of weeks.
That's right. You and I are the weirdos that actually click in and read these articles and give them thought about what they're saying and why it may or may not be right.
Well, and I'd like to think that while I may not know, much about other stuff that I read, and there's a lot of it, at least with this, I feel like we can help guide other people along the journey, right?
That's right. So our goal is to go beyond the headline for our listeners to let them know what this article is saying and why it may or may not be important to you and how you think about things.
Right.
So up first on the list today is an article from the Washington Post about a bucket list life goals. And it's not necessarily so much about creating a bucket list, but it takes a different view on, are there some life goals that maybe you should let go of? And it struck me as interesting because we always kind of, we live in a society that is all about setting and achieving goals, right? Like we don't, in America, we don't really do failure well. We don't really do, hey, we're going to set this goal and then, go on to something else when we don't get there. That's not kind of how we're programmed, or that's not how kind of society views things. So I found it very interesting, and it kind of, just along with this, there's always been this analogy of putting rocks in a jar, right? Like if you fill up your time, you want to put the rocks in first to make sure they get done and then fill it up with sand and water and all the other little stuff around it.
Right.
But nobody ever questions whether or not you're putting the right rock in there, right?
Right. Right.
And so this is an article really about figuring out which one of those rocks that you want to pursue and how to prioritize them, but also reprioritize them. And so the author actually talks a lot about how his dad had always talked about wanting to learn Spanish and going to Mexico or Spain, one of those, I can't remember exactly where, like that was one of his big goals. Mm-hmm. And when he finally gave up on it, it was kind of like a sense of relief because he knew he just had other things that he wanted to accomplish and that wasn't it anymore. And I think that is just a great reminder that just because you have this bucket life goal, you're going to change and things are going to change. Right. And it's okay to let go of some of those.
Well, so this is something I've been thinking about in other contexts a lot personally lately is like what is it about that goal that makes it appealing right now? Is it the challenge of learning a new language? Is it the thought of going somewhere different and exciting? Don't get wrapped up in the like specifics, right?
Right. Yeah.
But like, what is it about that that's important to you? And a kind of another thing there too is, at least for me personally lately, it's been thinking about the things that, like, am I really doing it because it's important to me? Or am I Like, is my goal to go to Yosemite driven by the fact that everybody goes, if you're going to go to a national park, you go to Yosemite, right?
Yeah.
And is that what's important? And
Mm-hmm.
and or there's a lot of different contexts you can steer that to, but I really like this idea of reevaluating that bucket list and really thinking about how it might change over time, and
and it
refocus.
absolutely will, and it should change, right? Like,
Yeah.
a couple of things that sparked me as interesting based on what you said there, Dave. And one is when we went through and did the life planning training, one of the things was always like, what happens if somebody has a life goal that they can't achieve, right?
Right.
And
Right.
it's interesting because you're bound to run into them, right?
Yeah.
And what kind of the takeaway or how to think about that was, it's not so much the goal itself. It's more about like, what do the emotions spark, right?
Yeah.
So if your goal is to have a house on the ocean, but you're never going to afford a $10 million house on the ocean, the idea was, why don't you visualize yourself in that place? Who's around you? What are you doing? What are you feeling? Because all of those things can be recreated.
Right.
You can't necessarily own the ocean, but a house on the ocean, but you can recreate those feelings of who's around you. What are you feeling? What are you doing? And so I think that strikes me as interesting as it relates to the kind of chuck it list of, you might not get the ultimate goal, but you can probably more than likely recreate the feeling some way.
Right. And I had forgotten about that from the Kinder training when I was thinking about this the other day. And you're absolutely right. It's about like finding that that essence of the idea. Yeah. Which kind of to segue, and I'm going to skip one on our list because I think this is a natural segue.
Sure.
One of these articles is a flexible goal, having flexible goals for happiness and success, from Darius Faroo. And, kind of along those same lines is, don't get fixated on the specifics so much as the idea, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there, he gives a great example of, I want to earn $100,000 versus I want to earn more than last year, right? Like, that's just another, like, you can achieve earning more than last year and not necessarily get to that 100,000 mark and still feel really good about yourself.
Right. It doesn't mean you've failed just because you didn't reach a specific dollar amount. If you move the ball, right?
Right. And that goes back to, and I think that we did a book review on the gap and the gain, which is don't focus on how short you were, focus on how far you've come, right? The gain of where you were and where you are now.
And the other thing that I was reminded of when I read this article was Morgan Housel's talk about for most people, what really matters with money is being able to buy control of your time, right?
Yep.
And so, like, making a specific goal of, like, I want to retire at 62 with X dollars. Really, what would make you happy is just having more control of your time and more flexibility over how you spend it. And that doesn't, you don't need to get as wrapped up. That's what you really should be working towards, is getting that ability to have that independence and that freedom. And then you can decide when you want to retire, because you might get to 62 and decide you don't want to retire.
Yeah.
And it may not have anything to do with finances.
Right.
So, and you and I as planners, I think we talked about this just off to the side a couple of weeks ago, that idea is kind of in tension with the idea that sometimes people do better with specific goals, even if that it's going to change.
Right.
Like being able to say to somebody, we're going to try to have X dollars in your flexible spending fund by, next December, gives them a concrete thing to shoot for. That sometimes helps. Like, okay, that's $1,000 a month and I need to, come up with that in my budget and work towards that. That can help. But at the end of the day, if it's $10,000, they're not a failure, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's like trying to balance those two ideas as a planner can be an interesting juxtaposition.
Well, I think the other part that's, somewhat concerning about a fixed goal is it's especially when it comes to money, it seems like when you get to that point, it's never enough, right? When you're so
Right.
focused on, hey, I
Right.
want to earn $100,000 a year. The first thing you probably start thinking about after you hit 100 is, well, maybe I should earn, $200,000 a year or 150, right? Like it's always a moving target.
Unless you're using that money in such a way that it does create that underlying happiness or work you closer towards having that freedom and control, it's probably not going to matter.
Right. Yeah. And that's the benefit of a flexible goal. It's not necessarily about the dollar amount. It's about what's what do I get out of getting, when I get to that point, what am I feeling? What am I doing? What am I able to do that I wasn't able to do? Right.
Yeah. Well, I thought this was a really good blog article and I think it's a good one to share.
Yeah, and I think, I like how he ended up where, SMART goals still being specific, but only for things that are in your control, right?
Yeah.
That's a great way to look at that. It still makes sense to be specific and goal oriented, but do it with things that are in your control, not worrying about the things that you can't control and aren't going to be able to get there because of that. Yeah. Or you get there on accident and you didn't really have anything to do with you, right?
Right. Yeah. Way to go. So we should probably back up because I think the one we skipped over, since those two were connected, I think is a fun one to go back and talk about. The article in the Wall Street Journal from last month about the least romantic date night.
That's right. The least romantic date night. And that is the financial date night, right?
Right.
And it actually went into a lot of what I thought was really helpful, thought process around, if you're actually going to do this and be intentional about it, you can still have fun with it, right?
Right.
And then kind of the purpose, the main purpose behind it is, if you look at money, it has been, and for a while, and probably will continue to be, one of the leading causes of divorce, right?
Right.
That's
biggest source of marital stress.
Right. Exactly. And so the idea behind it was, the main goal is you want to be having these conversations with your partner, right?
Yeah.
The more open you are, the more you communicate together, the science backs it up, the better your money life will be. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, hey, let's sit in front of a computer and have a spreadsheet conversation and get mad at each other, or, you know what I mean?
Right.
You can have fun with it. And their idea was, actually having a money date where you can go out, you can even dress up, you can go to a nice restaurant and have the conversations around how you're spending money and why and what you need to do to be successful.
Yeah, or that's the night you order in from the nicest restaurant in town, I think was one of the things they talked about, or, save that nice bottle of wine you got, at some special occasion, set it aside for that night. And, which made me chuckle a little bit because I think the few times my wife and I have done something like this similar, it was more like we sat down and muscled through it before we could go have fun. It's like, okay, we can't, go, we can go out to dinner and we can get a bottle of wine and have a good time. But first we got to do this chore,
Right.
So, and I've talked to clients that have tried similar, I've never really sat down and said, this is what you need to do with anybody. You've got to, make a financial date night. But I have talked to clients kind of anecdotally, have said, oh yeah, we did that over dinner, the other night and worked through it. I've never had anybody make a habit out of it though.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's an interesting idea.
Yeah. I mean, if you can, I think that's kind of the point is if you can make it fun to some degree, maybe it will be more of a habit and it won't be such a chore. And that has huge benefits of having consistent conversations around this stuff.
Well, that ties into a whole bunch of habit forming concepts. But yeah, if you tie some kind of reward to it. And the other thing is to come up with a framework where right away you're going to see some successes from doing it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
If you can pick some small things that you can tackle together, like, hey, we need to find a way to reduce what we're doing here, or, rethink how we're spending that particular part of our budget, and then see some success a month or two down the road, you're more likely to then take the next steps, right?
Right. And I thought it was interesting in all of the examples. My favorite one was this idea of a pitch meeting. And it
Yeah.
actually had an example of a guy who wanted to like spend their resources on a new bike for himself.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
had a pitch
Yeah.
meeting with like a
Yeah.
PowerPoint and all
Yeah,
kinds of
I was
stuff to
picturing
try to
like
get his
Shark
wife to
Tank with my
convince.
wife and
Yeah,
kids. Like,
exactly.
like, here's what I want to do. Will you buy into this? But the point is very real, right? And we say to
Yeah,
clients a lot, it's a team sport, right? If you guys
absolutely.
have to get on the same page because you're sharing the
Yep.
same balance sheet. So
Yeah. And they actually, I think the end result of that was they made a good compromise where he sold his old bike and, some
hmm
different things. But
hmm
I just thought
yeah.
that was interesting and fun.
So that's a good read for anybody who's like looking for ways to open those communication channels with their spouse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the next one on our list, I guess we can't get rid of, we can't go through an entire month without talking about inflation in one way,
Right.
shape, or form,
Right.
right?
Darn it.
And
Yeah.
so there's this idea that's come out of the summer spending spree, and that is what they're calling funflation, right?
Yeah.
And the Wall Street Journal wrote an article that things like live event prices have increased significantly, and now we're at the point where maybe they've gotten expensive enough that 60% of Americans say that they're going to cut back spending on live entertainment due to that cost increase. So I'm thinking like, I know obviously everybody heard about in some way, shape, or form, more than likely the Taylor Swift concert and
hmm
that, the $1 billion gross and all the, inflationary prices around how much those tickets were. So I think a
Right.
lot of people like went out and spent a lot of money on some of these live events and were kind of at the point that they got so expensive that it's starting to turn people away.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
It'll be interesting one to see. I feel like as Americans, we're good at saying we're not going to do things, but then we end up finding ways to spend that money anyways.
Right.
So, will those prices come back down? Will people still keep spending on them? Stay
Yeah.
tuned. Hard to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. Well,
But it was definitely interesting that the cost of admissions and fees rose faster than the price of food, gas, and other staples in 2022.
yeah, and a couple of things come to mind. First of all, we always are talking to people about spending money on experiences and memories and things like
Yeah,
that versus stuff, and this kind of fits the bill. So it's a
absolutely.
little, I'd love to see the price of luxury watches go up faster than Taylor Swift and baseball games, but that's kind of like the inverse. And then just the idea too that um, when we think about inflation, my mind always goes to the idea that, well, if the price gets high enough, people will stop doing it, and then the price will come back down, right?
Right,
And
right.
probably we're just getting to the point where people are like, that really wasn't, that concert was great, but it really wasn't worth what I paid or what I did for it. Maybe we're not
Yeah.
there. I don't know, but the market does self-correct a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have our own, I guess our own local tie-in to that would be, and I don't know if you've looked recently, Dave, but been poking around at some Detroit Lions tickets now that
Mm-hmm.
they're actually supposedly good again. I mean, I'll reserve judgment on that until the
Hey,
end of the
hey,
year
we're a
and how
couple.
they
I
finish.
always like Thanksgiving Day will be the if they can look decent on Thanksgiving Day, that'll be
Yeah,
the
yeah.
test. But yeah,
Well,
yeah,
that's interesting because those ticket prices you used to be able to go pretty inexpensive,
yeah,
and now you're talking about $200 to $300 just to get in the building. So
right,
I've seen a drastic increase in those prices. Some of that has
right,
to do with how well they're playing and how many people want to go,
yeah,
but also it's that idea of a live event, right?
yeah, yeah. And I'm a huge football fan, but I decided, and this had nothing to do with the quality of the Lions' play on the field. To me, at a certain point, football became more of a TV sport, at least professional football, than an
Mm,
in-person sport. And I don't
yeah,
know, I kind of decided 10 years ago I wasn't going to go to another NFL game.
yeah,
So, that price for me was lower despite being a big football fan.
right.
So, everybody's got their own level for fun stuff, right?
Absolutely. Yep. All right, moving along. I think we got a couple more, but this one is on the rise of the mass affluent.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
This
what
is
does
an
that mean,
interesting
Dave?
one. Yeah. Never mind the 1%. Many millionaires are where wealth is growing fastest. I don't love the title of the article, but it was an interesting idea. And this is from the Wall Street Journal from a couple of weeks ago, looking at what the rise in inflation and generally strong investment markets over the last several years, the recent history notwithstanding, I guess, that, we've seen a definite rise in what they term mini millionaires, but I would just, say like the middle class and upper middle class in America has done a lot better than I think most people would guess in terms of growing their balance sheets and wealth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. When you think about what's going on, obviously, if you're just reading the headlines,
Mm-hmm.
you might think that, the market's not doing great. There's this real estate crisis. And that isn't necessarily not true. It's just affecting different people differently. So this,
Right.
if you think of the millionaire next door who's got his house, maybe they have a
Mm-hmm.
mortgage, but they probably got it a couple of years ago at below 3%. The value of their real estate's going up. Their portfolio has actually gone up in value. So they've had a lot of positive things and haven't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily been as affected by the rise in interest rates or the rise in inflation than you might assume.
Right. Right. And the article does not blow off the idea of income disparities and that that everybody is better off than they were 10 or 15 years ago, but it does a pretty good job of combating that misperception that only the ultra wealthy are succeeding in this economy.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's important.
So, last on our list, Dave, and this is actually an update from our episode 113 that we did in April, and that is there has never been a worse time to buy instead of rent, according to the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we talked about this in April, and these are some updated numbers from that discussion in April. But according to this article, the cost of buying a home versus renting is at the most extreme since at least 1996, almost 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was really surprised to see that it was worse now than it would have been, say, 2005, 2006.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah. But essentially, their estimate is on average it's 52% more expensive to buy a home than to rent one right now because of mortgage rates and property value increases.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like new entrants into the housing market, you got a double whammy of house values have continued to rise and mortgage rate interest rates have continued to rise, although it does look like they went down a little bit this week with the Fed pausing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they're still, at that 7 to 8% range, depending on what you're getting into. So you've got higher prices and you've got higher costs in terms of getting a mortgage, and that's kind of a double whammy.
Right.
So when you look at that compared to the cost of rent, which has also gone up a little bit, not nearly as fast as the cost of buying and getting a mortgage at those higher interest rates. So that's kind of the dynamic of what people are looking at.
Yeah.
In terms of housing costs.
Yeah. And, it to me, a lot of that just comes down to the individual level and talking about, first of all, different markets are different.
Yeah.
But more importantly, or, at least on an individual level, is talking about like, why do you want to buy a house? What are your goals? And, it's very different, depending on your time frame, depending on what your options are, what it is about renting that doesn't work for you. There can be a lot of reasons why it's still worth it to buy a house. it's just not as easy to say it's an automatic decision.
Absolutely. And I've had conversations with clients recently that are wanting to buy a house. The big, like they own a house, that a couple of them that I've talked to have owned a house. They need a bigger space. And, yes, it's going to be higher now, but not necessarily forever. I think if you're going to be there for a long time, what people fail to kind of realize sometimes is, yes, your payment's going to be higher, but also think of it in terms of your payment's not going to go up, right? Like if you have a 30-year mortgage, your payment's going to stay the same. Yes, your insurance will go up. Yes, your taxes will go up, but that's not nearly as big of a portion of what your principal and interest will be. If anything, interest rates will come down and you'll refinance and that payment will actually go down. But your income during the same 30 years should be going up if you're continuing to work. So you got this dynamic where every year your housing costs actually get cheaper over time, less expensive in comparison for most people.
That's often lost.
Yeah. So again, it's just a matter of like, are you buying a house because you want to be here for the next 3 to 5 years and then you're going to leave? Or do you want to buy a house that you can raise your kids in for the next 20 years and don't see yourself making changes or doing differently?
Well, and I don't think you're going to see a lot of people talking about flipping homes here for a while.
No. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So interesting. Going back to the numbers side of it real quick, 52% higher than the average apartment to rent. Back in 2006, that premium was 33%. So quite a bit higher really back in 2006. Yeah.
So that's a good read, though, if you're interested in the nuts and bolts on how that works.
Absolutely. Well, that was our list for the month of October, Dave. So that was fun. Enjoyed it. To our listeners, if you have an article that you are reading and want to pass along, we would love to take a look at it. You can email us that at info@srbadvisors.com and tune in next month when we review what we've been up to and what we've been reading for November. Dave, as always,
good stuff,
been a
Nick.
pleasure.
Yep.
This is a Zedia Media production.